Pixar has been so ingrained within Disney for so long that it's hard to imagine what a different timeline would look like if they weren't working together. But it is a timeline we nearly got. The two companies began working with each other in the early 1990s, culminating in the deal for Disney to co-fund and release 1995's Toy Story, which then flourished into a much larger partnership. But it was a relationship that was very one-sided. Disney got a lot, and Pixar got very little. And as 3D animation became a more sought-after medium to moviegoers, it bred discontent in the House of Mouse that Pixar were doing animated features better than Disney, the studio that was once thought to be the home of animated features. And as one company grew and the other fell, Pixar wanted out of their Disney partnership, which ended up being trickier than they thought due to the unfair terms that Disney had laid out in the original deal. Disney needed Pixar, and Pixar couldn't leave Disney. It would end with a Disney CEO losing his position in the company because he could not secure a new agreement, and his replacement coming up with a simpler solution: buying Pixar. This is how Disney screwed Pixar and then bought them. This episode of Cutscene wouldn't be possible without the support of our fantastic sponsor, Raid Shadow Legends.
Can I just show you this trailer for this new Raid Shadow Legends? Because it's a really cool trailer and I think you'll get a bit of a kick out of it.
Let's give it a watch. A watch!
A watch, very nice.
Yes, because it's Alice in Wonderland theme. There's Alice, she's falling. That's crazy this is in Raid.
Yeah.
Because I'm used to big ogres and fantasy elements. This is oh, cool.
Like the almost Joker-esque drink me
Yeah.
on the sides.
This is badass Alice.
It is.
Uh-oh, she's gone goth. Oh my god, that Mad Hatter is scary.
It's terrifying.
And what's that, like a sort of metal Harley Quinn style Queen of Hearts?
Starting from January 8th, players can get their hands on Alice the Wanderer, Cheshire Cat, Mad Hatter, Knave of Hearts, and the fearsome Queen of Hearts. You can get the legendary champion Alice the Wanderer for free, along with a bunch of rewards simply by opening Raid Shadow Legends on 14 different days, including Alice the Wanderer on day 7 and a 2-star Perfect Soul for her on day 14. We've even created a clan called Cutscene, which you can join too by clicking the link in the video description down below or scanning the QR code on screen and playing and supporting Cutscene while also claiming some amazing bonuses for yourself. Don't forget to use the promo code Monkey King before February 7th to get legendary champion Sun Wukong for free too.
Click the link in the description or scan my QR code to get 2 epic heroes available only via my link. You'll immediately get a huge starter pack with an epic champion, Ultimate Galek from the Orcs faction. Ultimate Galek is also very strong due to his ability to reduce turn meter. Overall, a really strong epic, and you'll get another starter pack after reaching level 15 that includes an epic Faye. Many consider her as a better champion than some legendaries.
Thank you so much to Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this episode. Click the link in the video description down below. Pixar began life in the mid-1970s as the computer graphics lab at the New York Technical Institute by Alvy Ray Smith and Ed Catmull, with funding by millionaire Alexander Schur. As far back as that decade, Smith and Catmull were convinced that computer animation was the future and wanted to make a feature film. Realizing they were IT guys and not storytellers, they looked to partner with Hollywood studios, but all offers, including one to Disney, were turned down. Catmull writes in Creativity Inc., "It's hard to imagine now, but in 1976, the idea of incorporating high technology in Hollywood filmmaking wasn't just a low priority, it wasn't even on their radar." That all changed the following year with the release of Star Wars.
The overwhelming success of the picture surprised everybody, including Fox, the producer Gary Kurtz, and the director George Lucas.
George Lucas had used a lot of practical effects on Star Wars, but his Industrial Light and Magic team were pushing the boundaries of visual effects and sound design.
Star Wars, a billion years in the making.
And in 1979, now funded by the success of Luke Skywalker and Friends, Lucas was able to launch a computer division. Catmull was headhunted by Lucasfilm, and he and Smith moved to California to start work on what would be called the Graphics Group as part of Lucasfilm's computer division. It was here that they built the Pixar Image Computer, which would take film, overlay special effects, and then record back to film. Remarkably, This was seen as controversial within Lucasfilm, as the graphics group pushed ideas like editing films on computers. Catmull writes, while George wanted this new editing system in place, the film editors at Lucasfilm did not. They were perfectly happy with the system they'd mastered. That system, of course, being slicing film with razor blades, then gluing it back together. Because of this resistance, their work was ground to a halt. In 1983, they were visited by animators from Disney, and one of those animators, John Lasseter, was blown away by the work they were doing. Lasseter was trying to pitch to Disney an idea called the Brave Little Toaster, which would combine hand-drawn animation with computer-animated backgrounds. Disney, however, found the idea too avant-garde and fired him. He then joined Catmull & Co. at Lucasfilm, and now they had a storyteller. Sadly though, George Lucas did not see the graphics group as a film division. He saw them as a hardware manufacturer. As such, even though they were working on short film ideas and even made The Adventures of Andre and Wally B, Lucas was never going to give them the go-ahead to make a full movie. After all, Moore's Law suggested that it would still be a few years before there were computers powerful enough to do an entire film. Smith would tell Variety in 2006, George Lucas looked at us as hardware. That was his mistake. There's been a long-standing rumor online that the failure of 1986's Howard the Duck led to Lucas selling Pixar, but those involved say that discussions of the sale started a lot earlier. In 1983, Lucas began a very costly divorce from his wife Marcia, and with their visions no longer aligning, he decided to sell the graphics group and their Pixar image computer for the price of $30 million. One potential buyer was Disney, with some keen on buying the graphics group for $15 million. However, according to James Stewart's Disney War, Jeffrey Katzenberg said of the offer, "I can't waste my time on this stuff, we've got more important things to do." In the end, the group was set to be sold to Philips and General Motors, who offered the most money. For the latter, they saw the graphics group hardware as a great tool to use for designing new models of cars, which meant that the dream of making a feature-length animated movie would be dead forever. Just 1 week before the deal was completed, it fell apart. Catmull writes, "To this day, I am thankful the deal went south, because it paved the way for Steve Jobs."
Steve Jobs has gone into yet another new business. He just bought Pixar, a company which makes a high-end graphics computer. Pixar had been created by filmmaker George Lucas.
The Apple co-founder had already had an offer of $5 million turned down by Lucas, but when he doubled it with $5 million of his own money as an investment, Jobs purchased the graphics group from Lucasfilm, and the company was renamed to Pixar. Perhaps now they could make that feature-length movie. Just wanted to shout out the fine folk on screen who backed us at patreon.com/cutscene, where currently there are nearly 10 hours worth of reviews of Spider-Man 3 and Madam Web, featuring myself and WrestleTalk's Ollie Davis. This month we'll be looking at Morbius to see if it really is worse than Madam Web. If you enjoy the movies we make here at Cutscene, please do consider morbing time on over to patreon.com/cutscene to support us. Thanks again to the great names on screen who have backed us so far. Despite wanting to be creatives, Pixar remained a manufacturing company for the most part, selling their Pixar image computer and developing rendering software RenderMan and 3D software program Typistry for Apple and Windows machines. But they struggled to find their foot and identity in the market. Perhaps part of this was Steve Jobs' split time between Pixar and Next, the company he founded after leaving Apple in 1985. Ed Catmull writes in Creativity Inc. that Jobs would only visit Pixar once a year, while Catmull would visit Next all the time to update Jobs on Pixar business. Tensions between Jobs and Smith led to the latter leaving the company a few years later. Pixar did have some creative successes though. 1986's Luxo Jr., the lamp would become iconic in Pixar's logo animation, earned them an Academy Award nomination, and 1988's Tin Toy won them an Oscar. But the company was still hemorrhaging money. Catmull writes, for obvious reasons, this increased tensions with Steve. We didn't feel that he understood what we needed, and he felt that we didn't understand how to run a business. We were both right. Catmull claims that Jobs sunk $54 million of his own money into Pixar. They only sold around 300 Pixar image computers, and they didn't have the resources to build new technology. At their core, Pixar was not a hardware company. They wanted to be an animation house. Catmull writes, this was where our true passion resided, and the only option left was to go after it with everything we had. In the early 1990s, Pixar began making commercials for products like Tropicana, but it still wasn't enough to offset their costs. In 1991, they had to lay off a third of their staff, and a frustrated Jobs looked to sell Pixar. But despite offers of upwards of $90 million from the likes of Microsoft and Silicon Graphics, Jobs walked away from every deal put before him. Catmull writes that Jobs' theory was that if Microsoft was willing to pay $90 million, then maybe Pixar was worth keeping on to. Jobs would tell Businessweek in 1998 of Pixar's trouble in the early days, there were times that we all despaired, but fortunately, not all at the same time. Although they sold 300 Pixar image computers, in the end, only one of them truly mattered, the one they sold to Disney in 1986. They then developed software called Computer Animation Production System, better known as CAPS, which automated the laborious ink and paint method of animation. It was used in 1988's Magical World of Disney on NBC, and in the second to last shot of 1989's The Little Mermaid. It was planned to be used for a series of Roger Rabbit shorts, but is most notably used in 1990's The Rescuers Down Under, which is the first fully digital feature film, a Guinness World Record. But really, it wasn't the technology and software that Disney were interested in with Pixar. It was the creative mind of John Lasseter. Disney's Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg were very impressed with Tin Toy and wanted to lure Lasseter back to the Disney animation team that had fired him a few years earlier. When Lasseter remained loyal to Pixar, the next best thing was to work with them. This was not the outcome that Disney wanted. Katzenberg is quoted as saying in the Pixar Touch, "If I had my way, we wouldn't be doing this." This sentiment extended to the rest of Disney. As Pixar's head of animation, Ralph Guggenheim, says in the Pixar Touch, "We got a rather cool sort of reception from Disney where we were told, we know how to do this better than you guys." It became clear that basically they were being told by Jeffrey Katzenberg they had to do this. They didn't like the idea of engaging an outside animation studio. The idea, which was unusual for Disney, was that Pixar would make movies for Disney based on their own ideas and not scripts from the House of Mouse. In July 1991, Disney signed a deal for Pixar to make 3 animated movies, which would be co-funded and distributed by Disney, with a caveat that would become part of the breaking point between the two companies. Disney owned everything. This was not a deal that Pixar wanted, and during the negotiation period approached Paramount, Columbia Pictures, and Universal, but none of them made offers. Disney drove a hard bargain. They wanted the rights to Pixar's technology, which Jobs took off the table. Jobs wanted to keep hold of the sequel and film rights, but Katzenberg took that off the table. David Price writes in the Pixar Touch, "The financial terms of the 13-page contract were lopsided enough that unless the film were a hit on the level of The Little Mermaid, Pixar's earnings from it would be insignificant." Disney had the right to cancel the film at any point. Pixar would get back its incurred cost and a $350,000 cancellation fee, and although it was really for 3 films, the second and third film would only be made if Disney wanted them. Katzenberg would have final creative sign-off, could bring in his own writers if he was dissatisfied with the movie, and, most crucially, Disney would hold 100% ownership of the film, as well as sole discretion over sequels, remakes, television shows, and direct-to-video productions. Pixar would be the first point of contact to make these Disney-led films, but Disney retained the right to take it elsewhere if a deal could not be reached. In that case, Pixar would get a small percentage of revenue and would have no creative say. For their troubles, Pixar would get around 12.5% of the ticket revenue. Lasseter is quoted of the negotiations as saying, "Watching Steve and Jeffrey go at it, I was in awe. It was like a fencing match. They were both masters, but Katzenberg went into it with a saber, Jobs with a mere foil." The deal was worth $26 million, and Pixar agreed. They were finally making a feature-length movie, and it was to be called Toy Story.
You are a toy!
So why accept the deal? Well, the reality was, as Walter Isaacson writes in Steve Jobs' biography, Pixar was on the verge of bankruptcy and needed a deal with Disney far more than Disney needed a deal with Pixar. Basically, Disney could afford to help make this movie, and Pixar could not do it without them. David Geffen, 1/3 of founders of future Disney rivals DreamWorks, told Businessweek in 1998, "There is no such thing as a great deal with Disney. They control the property, and they are just giving Pixar some of the profits." Originally, Pixar pitched the idea of making a half-hour TV special called A Tin Toy Christmas, a good next step from making 5-minute shorts to a full film. Katzenberg argued that if they were going to assemble a team to make a 30-minute TV special, they may as well go all in and do a feature film. Ed Catmull writes in Creativity Inc., "You've probably heard the maxim that it's best to assemble your parachute before you jump out of a plane. Well, In our case, we were already in freefall and not one of us had made a parachute before. Toy Story went through various changes in the creative process. The original pitch, which had Tinny from Tin Toy Star alongside a ventriloquist dummy, later became a cowboy figure named Woody and a space ranger named Buzz Lightyear. What originally saw two toys looking for the same goal became an odd couple movie. Katzenberg suggested to Lasseter to watch movies like 48 Hours and Thelma and Louise to improve the character dynamics of Woody and Buzz. Disney did bring on some of their own writers to work on the script, including Joss Whedon, but Lasseter was able to keep away their biggest pitch for the movie: make it a musical. The Disney Renaissance began with The Little Mermaid in 1989 and then saw bigger hits in Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. And all of those were Broadway-style musicals. Katzenberg felt that Toy Story should copy that successful template. Price writes in the Pixar Touch, Lasseter resisted the musical theatre approach they wanted, believing musical numbers would take Toy Story out of its reality. Disney and Pixar reached a compromise that the characters in Toy Story would not break out into song, but the film would use songs over the action to convey and amplify the emotions Woody and Buzz were feeling. In 1993, 2 years after the deal between the two companies was made, the script for Toy Story was finally approved by Jeffrey Katzenberg. But in November of that same year, Peter Schneider, president of Disney's feature animation department, saw early storyboard sequences, animatic reels, and decided that Toy Story should be shut down. Thomas Schumacher, another Disney executive, agreed, and so did Jeffrey Katzenberg. Price writes, on that day, dubbed Black Friday, Schneider told Pixar to shut the film production immediately. Animation, recently started, could not resume unless and until they submitted a new script and Disney approved it. Catmull writes the shutdown was terrifying, noting that their first film was now on life support. The belief was that Pixar had taken on too many of Katzenberg's notes, and what they needed to do was to listen to their own instincts. So Lasseter and the Pixar creative team, Andrew Stanton, Pete Docter, Lee Unkrich, and Joe Ranft, spent every moment they could reworking Toy Story into the version of the film we know and love today. And their hard work paid off, as Toy Story was a massive success. Bloomberg Businessweek wrote, rather than the nice little film Disney expected, Toy Story became the sensation of 1995. Not only was this a great result for Disney, who now had a brand new film they owned outright and could merchandise to the nth degree, it was arguably an even bigger success for Pixar. Now they had some leverage. When Toy Story was shut down in November 1993, it ballooned the film's budget. Disney argued that Pixar should cover these costs. Steve Jobs didn't see it that way, and he flew to Jeffrey Katzenberg's office and said that it only got shut down because of Katzenberg's changes, and therefore it should be Disney that covered the costs. Ed Catmull, who negotiated a compromised new budget, is quoted as saying the incident did prompt Jobs to start plotting how to have more leverage with Disney in the future. He did not like being a mere contractor. He liked being in control. To get that control, Pixar would need a new deal with Disney. Although he had questions about it in the early stages, he actually met with suitors like Hallmark to sell Pixar throughout the production of the movie, Jobs fell in love with Toy Story as it neared completion. Walter Isaacson writes in his biography that Jobs would invite friends round to his house to show them scenes from Toy Story, to the point where some people claim it was an obsession. It wasn't just Toy Story. Pixar's software was instrumental in both Beauty and the Beast for Disney and the visual effects on James Cameron's Terminator 2 Judgment Day, two massive box office hits. When Jurassic Park became a monster hit in 1993, the idea of computer animation and visual effects was no longer just a fringe thing for nerds. It was becoming a Hollywood standard, and Pixar was at the forefront of that standard. Jobs decided, before the release of Toy Story, that Pixar should go public. Jobs' argument was that should Toy Story be a hit, Michael Eisner will have created his worst fear, a competitor in the animation market. Catmull writes, Steve predicted that as soon as Toy Story came out, Eisner would try to renegotiate our deal to keep us close as a partner. And that is exactly what happened. A few months after the release of Toy Story, Eisner called Jobs and asked to renegotiate their deal. Jobs wanted this new deal to be 50-50, and he'd raised $140 million by going public, which meant he could now present the idea of splitting production costs to result in a split of box office revenue after distribution costs, as well as merchandising and home video revenue. Essentially, it would make them an equal partner. More importantly to Jobs, though, was that this new deal would make sure that audiences were aware that any new Pixar movie would be just that, a Pixar movie. Several critics in their reviews of Toy Story had called it a Disney movie, despite the fact it was not made by the House of Mouse. This new deal would ensure that the Pixar name was given more prominence. Jobs said in 1998, "In Hollywood, there are very few brands, really just two, Disney and Spielberg. We want to be one too." In exchange, Pixar would make more films for Disney, which was great for Michael Eisner, as they would retain the rights to all the films made by Pixar, including the characters for merchandising and theme park attractions. On February 4th, 1997, a new 5-picture deal between Pixar and Disney was announced, which would begin with their next feature, A Bug's Life, in 1998. While this did feel like a good deal for Pixar, it was everything they wanted, the first signs of strain came shortly afterwards when Disney announced they would be making a direct-to-video sequel of Toy Story. This was, of course, part of the Disney deal. They could make direct-to-video sequels if they wanted and would hire Pixar to make them. The home video market had become a huge revenue generator for Disney in the mid-1990s, following the success of Aladdin: Return of Jafar. Part of that reason is they could be made much cheaper. The original Aladdin cost around $30 million to make. Return of Jafar cost just $3 million. It sold over 10 million copies within just a few months, and it cost a fraction of the price to make. Pixar agreed to make Toy Story 2 for Disney, but over time, it was costing more and more to make. Some have claimed that both Disney and Pixar believed too much in Toy Story 2 to simply dump it onto home media, but priced rights in the Pixar touch, as it turned out, the economics of a direct-to-video Pixar film weren't working as well as hoped. While happy to make Toy Story 2, it did come with a snag. Despite being released theatrically for Thanksgiving 1999, the new deal meant that Toy Story 2 did not count towards Pixar's 5 pictures for Disney. Price rights, Disney had bargained in the contract 5 original features, not sequels, thus ensuring 5 sets of new characters for its theme parks and merchandise. Pixar had, essentially, made Toy Story 2 for Disney for free. In all of this, Jeffrey Katzenberg had been fired by Disney and started a competitor along with Steven Spielberg and David Geffen called DreamWorks. Lasseter thought he had a good relationship with Jeffrey Katzenberg and even told him about their plans for their next movie, A Bug's Life, during post-production of Toy Story when Katzenberg was no longer working at Disney. But after DreamWorks signed a deal with Pacific Data Images, longtime friends of Pixar, they announced their first movie would be Ants, a film that had more than a few similarities with A Bug's Life. Lasseter is quoted in the Pixar Touch saying that he called Jeffrey Katzenberg and he started talking about all of this paranoid stuff and conspiracies that Disney was out to get him. He said he had to do something. That is when I realized it wasn't about me. We were just cannon fodder in his fight with Disney. Katzenberg might not have been all that paranoid though, as Eisner moved the release of A Bug's Life to open on the same weekend as DreamWorks' Prince of Egypt. Fighting back, Katzenberg moved up the release of Ants from March 1999 to be released 2 months before A Bug's Life. Insiders have said that Katzenberg offered PDI financial incentives to get Ants done before A Bug's Life, and both Steve Johns and John Lasseter have made the claim that Katzenberg called them and asked them to convince Disney to move the release date of A Bug's Life, and if they did, he would shut down the production of Ants. Pixar had become a pawn in the war between Eisner and Katzenberg. What worked in Pixar's favor, however, was that each movie was seemingly bigger than the last. A Bug's Life opened to $291 million compared to the $17 million that Ants made. Toy Story 2 made nearly $500 million worldwide, and 2001's Monsters, Inc. made nearly $580 million. But it was the release of Finding Nemo in 2003 that really started to show the cracks between Disney and Pixar, and this time they were much more public. In his autobiography, The Ride of a Lifetime, future Disney CEO Bob Iger wrote, "As Pixar's reputation and influence grew with each release, so did the tension with Disney. In Steve's mind, he and Pixar deserved more respect from Disney, and they wanted a contract to reflect the shifting leverage. He also thought that because they were eclipsing Disney both creatively and commercially, that Disney should have turned to them for creative assistance. Instead, he felt that Michael always treated them as a lesser partner in the relationship, a studio for hire, which he took as a huge slight." While Pixar were having huge successes, their films had now grossed over $1 billion in box office receipts, Disney were struggling. They had started the 1990s strong with the Disney Renaissance with The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, and Aladdin, and followed those up with the mega hit The Lion King in 1994. But Pocahontas, thought to be their big Oscar movie, did not perform as well as The Lion King. This was followed up by The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which earned less than Pocahontas. Hercules, Mulan, Tarzan, and Fantasia 2000 also underperformed, especially when compared to Disney's output in the first half of the 1990s, but especially when compared to Pixar's films. In a letter dated November 30th, 2003, Roy E. Disney announced his resignation from Disney and plotted out 7 points where he felt Michael Eisner had failed as leader. Point 6 of those 7 was the mismanagement of the relationship with Pixar. The breakdown of the relationship between Disney and Pixar can best be summed up as a breakdown of a relationship between Michael Eisner and Steve Jobs. When promoting iTunes, Apple used the slogan "Rip, Mix, Burn," and Eisner saw this as Apple, and therefore Jobs as he'd returned to the company to be its CEO in 1997, as promoting piracy. Crucially, it was the word rip, and Jobs publicly noted that Eisner didn't understand that this meant ripping a CD to a computer and not ripping someone off. Following the success of Monsters, Inc., Jobs said Pixar had successfully redefined Disney's business, turning out great films one after the other, while Disney turned out flop after flop, adding that he didn't understand why the CEO of Disney wouldn't come to Pixar for advice on how to make better movies. In 2002, Jobs informed Roy Disney that Pixar would not be renewing their Disney deal. Moreover, he said he would never deal with Disney while Michael Eisner was in charge. This prompted the war between Michael and Roy, which would lead to the Save Disney campaign of 2003.
If you're a Disney shareholder, in my view, the best way to help save Disney is to vote no on the re-election of Michael Eisner.
And the relationship with Pixar didn't get much better when a leaked memo from Eisner to Disney board members featured him trashing Pixar's next movie, Finding Nemo. In it, he wrote, "This will be a reality check for those guys. It's okay, but nowhere near as good as their previous films." Finding Nemo would go on to become the most successful animated movie of all time, when it made $868 million at the box office, toppling Disney's Lion King from the top spot. Jobs approached Eisner with a simple offer for a new deal. Pixar owns everything. It was, in essence, the opposite of the original deal. Pixar would fund all of their own movies, they would own all of the characters and rights to make sequels, and Disney would get a nominal distribution fee of around 7.5%. Not only that, but the final 2 films in the Disney deal, The Incredibles and Cars, would be included in this new deal, meaning Disney would not own them or its characters. Walter Isaacson writes, "It was so one-sided, it was clearly meant to be rejected." Bob Iger writes, "The rift between Michael and Steve was a clash between 2 strong-willed people whose company's fortunes were going in different directions." When Michael criticized the tech industry for not having enough respect for content, Steve was insulted. When Steve suggested Disney were creatively broken, Michael was insulted. In January 2004, Jobs announced publicly that Pixar would be parting ways with Disney, announcing they were open to negotiating with other studios to begin releasing new films in 2006. But the reality was, while Pixar seemingly had the upper hand, Eisner had the one true trump card. Disney owned everything. Sure, Jobs could announce he's approaching Sony and Warner Brothers about partnering with them, but Disney could make endless sequels to Toy Story, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, and Cars, and there was nothing Pixar could do about it. After the success of Toy Story 2, Disney asked Pixar to make a 3rd movie, and they declined. On January 2004, the negotiations between Pixar and Disney fell apart, and in March 2004, Eisner opened Circle 7 Animation, a division solely created to make sequels to Pixar movies. The people working there dubbed themselves Pixart, and they began work on Toy Story 3, Monsters Inc. 2, Lost in Scaradise, and Finding Nemo 2. Eisner knew how much these characters meant to those who created them. Lasseter even said, "I was worried about my children. What would they do with the characters we'd created? It was like a dagger to my heart. What did work in Pixar's favor, however, was that Jobs was not the only person who did not like Michael Eisner, and the Save Disney campaign was gaining traction, and it put a spotlight on Eisner's failings as Disney CEO. And in March 2005, Eisner announced that he would be stepping down from his position and would be replaced by Bob Iger, his second in command. The argument had been that Eisner's first 10 years as Disney CEO had been a major success and he turned business around, but the second 10 years was somewhat of a disaster, and there were no signs of the ship turning around under his leadership. The removal of Michael Eisner and the promotion of Bob Iger also helped the Pixar negotiations because Steve Jobs liked Bob Iger, and Bob Iger had a big plan for Pixar. In his autobiography, The Ride of a Lifetime, Bob Iger wrote, "The end of the Pixar partnership was a huge blow to Disney from both a financial and public relations standpoint. Steve was one of the most respected people in the world at that point. His rejection and withering criticism of Disney was so public, any mending of that fence would be seen as a big early win." One of Iger's first acts taking over from Eisner coincided with Eisner's last, which was the opening of Disneyland in Hong Kong. There, Iger realized during the parade that the cast of characters on float included those from the classic era, Snow White, Cinderella, Peter Pan, etc., and the Renaissance era like Aladdin, Beauty and the Beast, Little Mermaid, and The Lion King. There was nothing from Disney from the last 10 years worth of animated features. Nothing from Mulan, Tarzan, The Emperor's New Groove, Atlantis, Treasure Planet, Brother Bear, Home on the Range, and in their place were Pixar characters from Toy Story, Monsters Inc., and Finding Nemo. Disney's animated feature output from 1995 to 2005 saw very few hits. The only real hit was 2002's Lilo and Stitch. Iger claims in his autobiography that Disney spent over $1 billion making these movies and had lost around $400 million. But there's a bigger knock-on effect than box office figures. If the audience doesn't like or care about these characters, then you can't sell merchandise based on them. There's no room for clothing, theme park rides, direct-to-video sequels. You can make them, but there wasn't the same appetite for them as there was for Pixar's characters. For his first board meeting as CEO, Iger had only one topic he wanted to cover: the state of Disney animation. He'd asked the studio heads to put together a presentation of the last 10 years worth of releases, which they conceded to Iger would be ugly, and asked for market research on how mothers of young children saw Disney in comparison to their competitors. The results were not good, as Pixar had eclipsed Disney as the most trusted brand amongst families in America. Pixar had trumped Disney at their own game, but were also pushing technology boundaries better than Disney were. Realizing that 3D animated movies were outperforming traditional 2D animation, Disney opened a state-of-the-art animation studio called Secret Lab in 1999 to develop their own 3D movies, the first of which being 2000's Dinosaur. Price writes in the Pixar Touch that it performed okay, but adds its performance failed to justify its exuberant production costs. It was a poor omen for Disney's first attempt at independence from Pixar in computer animation. Their next movie, Wildlife, was to be a more brash film about youths who spend their nights partying and spending time at nightclubs. It didn't feel like a Disney movie, more like something that DreamWorks or Warner Brothers might make, complete with sexual innuendo. And when he saw early screen tests for it, Roy Disney shut it down and Secret Lab was closed in 2001. In short, in 1991, a struggling Pixar needed Disney. Just over a decade later, a struggling Disney needed Pixar. Iger tried to renegotiate a deal between the two companies, but Jobs came back with more or less the same offer he'd given to Michael Eisner. Perhaps the closest a deal might have come was Jobs offering Disney a 10% stake in Pixar as a company. They would have seats on the board and the right to distribute the films, but Pixar would own everything, including the valuable sequel rights. The problem perhaps was that this deal would essentially set Pixar up as a competitor to Disney, even if they did have a stake in them. Iger writes the financial value was heavily weighted towards Pixar. They'd get to make Pixar-branded movies and sequels which they'd own forever, and our role would be to serve as a passive distributor. When Iger presented his findings about the disastrous previous 10 years of Disney animated features and the parents' feedback, he came back with a simple idea: let's buy Pixar. Iger knew this was a risky move and wasn't even sure if Jobs would be willing to sell Pixar, but he knew he had to do something. And a good first step was that Iger was able to make a deal with Jobs, not between Disney and Pixar, but Disney and Apple. Iger was a huge fan of the iPod and used his a lot. When he took over as Disney CEO, he thought that the future of television would be on devices like the iPod and wanted to explore what that might look like. He mentioned this in one of his first calls with Steve Jobs, unaware that Apple were developing the next generation of iPod that could show music videos and TV shows. Apple and Disney struck a deal where two of the biggest shows in America, Desperate Housewives and Lost, which were both Disney shows, would be available for download on this new iPod, which they unveiled together on stage in October 2005. When it came to the Pixar deal, Iger was upfront with Jobs. Walter Isaacson writes, Iger went about it in an unusual way. When he first talked to Jobs, he admitted the revelation that had occurred to him in Hong Kong and how it had convinced him that Disney badly needed Pixar. Jobs adds, that's what I loved about Bob Iger. He just blurted it out. Now that's the dumbest thing you can do in a negotiation, at least according to the traditional rulebook. He just put his cards on the table and said, we're screwed. Disney allowed Iger to explore the idea of buying Pixar, so he called Jobs and asked him what he thought. To his surprise, Jobs was open to it. Jobs sought the blessing of Ed Catmull and John Lasseter and told them how easy it was to deal with Iger on getting TV shows on the iPod, saying that it was a night and day difference between the Eisner regime. He asked for them both to meet with Iger and get to know him. Iger would then spend time with both Catmull and Lasseter and visited Pixar to see what they were working on. When he saw Cars, Ratatouille and Wall-E, Iger told Disney that this was the future and they needed to get this deal done. Isaacson writes, he admitted he had no faith in the movies Disney Animation had in the works. The deal was a fairly simple one. Disney would buy Pixar for $7.4 billion in stocks, and Steve Jobs would become Disney's largest shareholder. Pixar would be integrated into Disney Animation, and John Lasseter and Ed Catmull would head up the merged studios. But key to all of this was that Pixar would remain a separate entity. Their offices would remain separate. They'd get to keep their email addresses. They would remain Pixar and would keep what made Pixar special. But there was one person who called Iger to tell him to shut the deal down: Michael Eisner. He told Iger that it was too expensive and that Iger could fix Disney Animation by himself without the help of Pixar and Jobs. Despite not being on the board anymore, Eisner managed to say his piece at a board meeting and made his pitch. You don't need to buy Pixar when you own the rights to make movies based on Pixar's properties. Eisner truly believed that Pixar's run of form would come to an end and argued that for this deal to be worthwhile, each new Pixar release would need to generate over $1 billion at the box office. Iger argued each of Eisner's points, and the Disney board sided with the new CEO and approved the deal. In 2006, Cars became the first Disney Pixar movie. Catmull writes, there's nothing quite like the feeling you get deep in your gut when you're about to stand up in front of the entire company and say something you know has the potential to be upsetting. The day Steve, John and I called an all-employee meeting to announce our decision to sell Pixar to Disney in 2006 felt like one of those moments. So why, after all of this time and negotiations, did Jobs, Lasseter and Catmull decide to sell Pixar to Disney? Outside of preferring the management style of Iger to Eisner, perhaps it really came down to one singular point: Disney owned everything. Case in point, one of the concerns about potential changes for Pixar following the Disney merger came from the decision that they would make more sequels to their own movies. Catmull writes, around the time of the merger, we were evaluating how to strike a balance between original films and sequels. We knew that audiences who loved our films were eager to see more stories set in those worlds, and of course, the marketing and consumer products people wanted films that were easier to sell, which sequels always are. However, if we only made sequels, we would wither and die. They decided a healthy balance would be one new original film every year and a sequel every other year. He adds, our decision, because of the proximity to the merger, made many people assume that Disney was pressuring us to make more sequels. This isn't what happened. In fact, Disney gave us a great deal of latitude. By being alongside Disney, Pixar could make the sequels they wanted to make and make them how they wanted to make them. Jobs said, when you see what that company did putting out Cinderella 2, you shudder at what would have happened. And on top of that, John Lasseter was now heading up the animation house that he had long dreamed of working for. Speaking with Variety in 2006, Pixar original founder Alvy Ray Smith said, Disney could have had us for free in the 1970s, and they could have bought us for $5 million from Lucasfilm, and they could have had us for $50 million after Steve bought us. They ended up paying $7 billion. And really, Disney ended up having the last laugh. While the movie was derided by fans on internet message boards, Cars became a huge hit for Disney. Variety estimates the movie made around $5 billion in merchandise alone in its first 2 years of release. Bob Iger told investors that it was the second most successful merchandise machine behind Star Wars. Michael Eisner called Bob Iger to tell him that he was wrong. And that is how Disney screwed Pixar and then bought them. Without that caveat in place where Disney owned everything, who knows what could have happened. Henson had begun to speak with Michael Eisner about selling the Jim Henson Company to Disney, as the pair had a relationship dating back to the late 1970s when Eisner gave The Muppet Show the green light at ABC. Eisner had joined Disney in 1984 with the idea that he, along with Frank Wells and Jeffrey Katzenberg, would fix the House of Mouse,